Kia ora, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, ko ingarangi te whakapaparanga mai, ko Lincolnshire te whenua tapu, no Scunthorpe au. Ko Aotearoa te kaina, ke tahuna o he noho ana. Ko Sarah Washbrook tōko ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora, everyone. My name is Sarah Washbrook, and I am very pleased to welcome you to our Wednesday monthly webinar from TENS. I am the Deputy Chair on the TENS Council, helping and supporting all educators from all fields in the area of technology education. Today's webinar, we will be looking at considering and applying Te Tiriti o Waitangi and Mātauranga Māori with Mātauranga with digital technologies in the education sector. Before we start today, we will say our karakia, and then we'll have a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce our presenter today. Māori ora kia a mātou, arahina mātou kia mātou mahi, ki mihia he huarahi mō te kaupapa o Mātauranga o Hangarau. A whina atu, a whina mai. Te po e here ne ia mātou. Hui e, tai ki e. So welcome on board. I am very honoured and privileged today to introduce our presenter and our speaker, Dr. Karaitiana Taiuru. Now, during the session today, normally what we would do is we have a full presentation and Q&A at the end. However, we want you to come on board with us and interact with our presentation, our webinar today. So should you wish to, please, there is a Q&A box and probably at the bottom of your pop-ups at the moment. Should you want to ask a question or stimulated to know some more about something, pop that the question in the Q&A box and we will keep an eye on that for you, and we will ask the question as we go along. There will be a Q&A session at the end as well for you, so please just keep an eye on that, and hope you enjoy today's session. But without further ado, I want to introduce our presenter today. So Dr. Taiuru is a visionary leader who explores the application of Māori rights and beliefs in the realms of digital and biological sciences. He is a leading authority and a highly accomplished Māori technology ethicist, specialising in Māori Data Sovereignty, Mātauranga, tikanga, Tiriti and Governance with emerging digital technologies. With his extensive expertise in Mātauranga and tikanga Māori and his advocacy for digital Māori rights and data sovereignty, Dr. Taiuru brings a profound understanding of the intersection between Māori knowledge and emerging technologies. And thank you, and I will let you take it away today.
Kia ora, Sarah, thank you for that. I'm just going to share my screen. So as Sarah said, this is probably a little bit different than what you are used to. So in Te Ao Māori, we like to interact during learning sessions. We call it wānanga. So I'm also conscious of the fact that I don't want, I could touch on a subject and then carry on to something else when there might be some really widespread interest and questions regarding something. So I would prefer to be able to answer your questions rather than just sit here lecturing you over something which may not be of that much interest to you. So I've tried to break the presentation up into 8 key areas. So the first one is touching lightly on the latest research about Māori and the technology sector from this year. Then looking at an introduction to some cultural practices, how Māori view data, Māori data sovereignty, legal and constitutional considerations that as teachers you should be aware of, and you should be aware of in your teaching. Touch on some Mātauranga Māori, some possible licenses when engaging with communities and how to engage with communities. Then some tips and some basic tikanga or some cultural practices. But again, as I said, if we can get questions throughout, that'll be awesome. So I'm assuming everyone can see the screen okay. Yep, cool. So these 4 research reports have only just come out this year. So I don't know whether as teachers you've had a chance to look at these. But each one of these documents has, a real rich amount of data or information about, what's missing with our students once they leave high school or once they leave university in terms of tech. So some of the finding is, it's quite shocking. Some of it's quite upsetting, but I'm of the opinion that this is a really good opportunity to empower the education sector, empower academia, and actually get our students more prepared for the digital world. So again, these are all freely available online, and I'm also aware that only today there was a digital skills report was published, and I haven't read it yet because I only saw it just before I logged on. So that's Tech NZ, I think it was, that produced that report, but you better find it on a Google search. So these, from the Mapping Māori Tech sector, this is interviews with a number of Māori IT practitioners, and so there was a number of key themes came out of that. So one of the first and most obvious recommendation from the tech sector was that Māori, whether they owned a business or whether they worked in digital and tech, they just basically said that there's a lot of tokenism, both when they were taught tech and in the tech industry. So I see this as an opportunity for teachers to actually, say, well, okay, this is how we can meaningfully apply Te Tiriti and Mātauranga Māori. So hopefully you'll get some of that through this. It was really obvious that tech sector and tech teachers don't often have the cultural capability, and nor do tech businesses. There's also, while this is more specific to businesses, I think this is a really good opportunity for tech teachers to engage with Māori teachers. And I think some really good partnerships here. Māori teachers, Māori language teachers, I should say, they may not see the benefit of partnering up, but we are seeing increasingly that there's a gap with Māori in the tech industry, and in order to help fix that gap, those partnerships are really, really important. It's also important for teachers, for the education sector, to engage more with Māori and with local iwi and hapu. And so this will in turn create more of a financial return for the communities while upskilling your students. There's mentors. So since, I think it's about 2002, we did some research that basically said, if for young Māori who want a new career, IT and tech, or we used to call it IT, but digital and tech, there's no role models. Māori are more likely to want to do something that they can see themselves reflected in. So that's usually things like sports, labouring jobs, trades jobs, etc. So if you can find mentors or just keep on referring to people in the industry, it's definitely a good way to help increase Māori participation and comprehension in tech. And it's also, again, it's really important just to normalise Mātauranga Māori and Māori culture. Too often, and it still happens now, I mean, a lot of people I know in the tech industry who are Māori, they have to, once they get to work, that's it. They have to stop being Māori. They have to adapt to Western principles. Again, so this is recognising that your students are part of a whānau. So ensuring that as teachers you can work with the individual and their whānau. Sorry, I've just got a question here. Okay, so this is a good opportunity to engage with the local iwi or hapu is as a school or an education organisation. If the organisation can start doing cultural training, noho marae, where you say at the marae and build those genuine relationships, is one way to stop over swamping the marae or the local iwi. So speaking from personal experience, I'm quite proactive with my marae in the Canterbury area, and so we do have academics and we have groups who want to form relationships, but quite often they turn up once, then they expect hours and hours of our time contributing back to them, and so we never see them or hear from them again once we start helping them. So it's really important to make those partnerships a long-term relationship. And so, so again, from a school level, ensuring that you have your senior leadership team, the principal, etc., involved in that relationship certainly helps. And it's a very quick way to ensure that your school gets to the top of the priority list of people who want to engage. So again, I was a general manager at a marae where this happened. And it was very obvious that the people with genuine commitments to that partnership and those who were just going to helicopter in and helicopter out again. Oh yeah, so definitely Maui Studios in Christchurch here, they're considered the role models, and they're certainly the best of the best in their area. Probably, well, certainly in terms of Māori, but they've definitely got national and international reputations. And I would strongly recommend, if you do have a relationship with Maui Studios, is to keep on engaging them, and then just make sure that there is that long-term relationship. So we mentioned before that some teachers may not have been brought up in New Zealand and may not realise some of the constitutional obligations. Also, for the older, sorry, I should say that for some parts of our society, the education system didn't teach us a lot of these constitutional obligations and considerations. So I'm just going to touch on these now. So the first constitution in New Zealand was called He Whakaputanga. So that was signed with the British and Maori tribes in the far north. And so that gave Maori sovereignty and a number of the same rights as Te Tiriti or Waitangi. And then we have Te Tiriti or Waitangi, which I'm assuming most teachers should know the basics about. They were signed by over 500 Māori chiefs from all around the country. If we have any teachers in the Whakatane Bay of Plenty area, there's a declaration called the Mātauranga Declaration. So this gives Māori the rights to intellectual property, which also includes digital. And then the New Zealand government has also signed up to the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which covers digital. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about these. So basically, He Whakaputanga basically says that Māori have full sovereignty and they can make decisions on their own. So this is quite important in terms of anything that uses Māori data. So He Whakaputanga, Article 2 gives Māori the sovereign right over their data. Article 3 is not really that relevant, but I mean, again, it just says that Māori have sovereignty and can use their own cultural practices. So the word tikanga is cultural practices in LORE. And again, the fourth article just reinforces that there's a binding agreement. So again, if you're in the far north, this is He Whakaputanga is spoken about and favoured more than Te Tiriti or Waitangi. So again, Te Tiriti or Waitangi, I think most people know, guarantees Māori sovereignty over what they consider a taonga or anything of significant value to them. So I'll cover some slides soon that will talk about why Māori data is a taonga and how Te Tiriti applies to it. But as teachers, with the data you have, I think it's your obligation to consider these articles of Te Tiriti and how you can apply them to any digital projects that use Māori data. So in 2021, a group of claimants took the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Crown to the Waitangi Tribunal for a breach of Te Tiriti with the CPPT TPPA. So the claimants argued that the Crown never engaged Māori with the e-commerce chapter. So the Crown in 2021 was so confident that they didn't need to engage Māori. Some of their statements were, well, Māori didn't have digital, we didn't have tech. I was one of the expert witnesses in that claim. And the Crown was so sure of themselves, they didn't even invite any expert witnesses to rebut any of us. So at the end of Y2522, the Waitangi Tribunal agreed and made the statement that Māori data is a taonga. So that means that all schools, government agencies, government departments, Crown agencies have an obligation under Te Tiriti to recognise that Māori data is a taonga and to protect it. So that reinforced another Waitangi Tribunal claim called the Y262 claim. So that's often called the flora and fauna claim. So that claim essentially says that anything that is Māori, anything that was pre-European in New Zealand, any knowledge, anything to do with Māori, even if it is a picture with a kuru design on it, the Y262 recommendations say that that needs to be considered as an Article 2 Te Tiriti right. So again, I'm not sure what sort of teachers we have here, but if you're doing any robotics, here's a set of Te Tiriti principles that I've adapted with robotics. I adapted these in conjunction with Te Tiriti lawyers and the School of Engineering at Auckland University. So this is just one way that you can be creative and consider how to implement Te Tiriti principles with any sort of tech that you do. These principles here are the latest principles from the Waitangi Tribunal. Previously, there used to only be three principles to abide or to recognise, and they used to be partnership, principles, and protection. So the Waitangi Tribunal ruled that those are now out of date. So again, if you're doing anything to do with robotics, I would recommend using these Te Tiriti principles. And the source at the bottom here has a lot more information about why this is important. There's some stats on how Māori are more represented with those manual labour jobs where robotics will take over. It talks about the economy, iwi and Māori economy, which can all fit into the robotics. Again, so if you're in the Bay of Plenty area, certainly it would be worthwhile checking out the Mātauranga Declaration. It's not that applicable to other people in New Zealand, but it's certainly held in high regard by the 9 iwi up in Bay of Plenty. So again, the UNDRA, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, New Zealand signed the agreement in 2010. And so this current government has invested quite a lot of money and resources into looking at how we can actually implement UNDRA into our day-to-day practices. Okay, so I think electronics, I'm not too familiar with how you'd do that in the class, but I think if you can recognize those principles and adapt them to electronics, I think that would certainly It'll help especially it'll help your Māori students to start feeling a little bit more at ease. And it's just another way of, incorporating Te Tiriti into your teaching. So each one of these articles on the screen is directly relevant to tech and digital. So again, I mean, this is most countries in the world have signed under it. And again, I think it's a positive document as teachers to be aware of. Something else that might empower Māori students or students in general is that New Zealand legislation recognises Te Tiriti or Waitangi in these three major tech pieces of legislation. So the digital identity framework it's a new piece of legislation which deals with data sovereignty, digital IDs, and basically has set up a Māori advisory group. That advisory group has myself, Dan Takanawa, and Warren Williams. So our role is to advise the Digital Identity Framework Trust on how they need to recognise Te Tiriti and data sovereignty. And it's within our powers, I guess, to formally write to the minister should the trust not implement or recognise data sovereignty principles. Stats New Zealand are quite committed to recognising Te Tiriti. They have a mana oriti agreement with the iwi Leaders Forum, and they've done a huge amount of work over the number of years, 3 or 4 years, to recognise Te Tiriti. Again, the Privacy Commissioner is also quite determined to recognise Te Tiriti. And that is in regards to data, biometrics, as well as other non-digital tech. It's really important to also understand that in 2022, our most highest court, the Supreme Court, ruled in the Peter Ellis case that tikanga Māori is New Zealand's first common law. So this has huge implications for all of society, but it also has huge implications for digital. So in terms of digital, this says that all Māori data and the systems that use them is a taonga, and that we need to have an understanding about Te Tiriti and data sovereignty because of this ruling. I also know that the Law Commission is going to publish a paper sometime in the near future about this decision and how it applies. Because another part of that ruling was that tikanga Māori applies to both Māori and non-Māori, because Peter Ellis, in this case, was not Māori, but they applied tikanga to his case. So basically, in terms of data, a taonga is anything that's of significant importance to Māori. So it doesn't have to be a physical object. It can be a thought, a song, genealogy, etc. So that's really important when we consider Māori data sovereignty. So before we do that, Māori data, as some teachers here, some of you might be saying, oh, Karaitiana, that looks more like information to me, or it looks like knowledge, not data. And yes, you are correct from a Western perspective. From a Te Ao Māori perspective, Māori data is anything that contains our knowledge. So it's a very broad definition. So this is the same definition that we use in the Waitangi Tribunal. It's the same definition that I use when I'm consulting with the government when they say that they don't have Māori data, or they're trying to make statements which I believe are contradictory to the truth. So this is an example of one aspect of what Māori data from a Te Ao Māori perspective could be. So right at the very top, we have some iwi consider that our world started with nothing in the darkness. And then we come down to Ranginui and Papatūānuku, the earth and sky parents. They had a child called Tāne Mahuta. So Tāne Mahuta is quite significant in terms of data, because traditional knowledge says that Tāne Mahuta went up to the space and brought back all the world's knowledge. So from a Te Ao Māori perspective, Tāne Mahuta is the deity of all Māori data. And then we keep on coming around. It's basically the genealogy of Māori. So you see, we come around to our ancestors and to iwi. So this shows that when we talk about anything data, anything tech related, it's not just the one individual. We need to consider the iwi, the hapu, the whānau, and the student. Again, this is a view of genetic data, which I'm assuming that we probably don't have. This is probably not too relevant, so I'm just going to just say that, yeah, everything in Te Ao Māori has a genealogy. When designing any systems for students that has Māori data in it, it's good to consider that Supreme Court ruling and the fact that Māori data could end up being given personhood at some time in the future. And there is conversations about how do we do that occurring right now. So Māori data sovereignty. So again, it's important to point out that Māori never ceded sovereignty. There is, for many years, there was always talk that Māori gave up their sovereignty for blankets or whatever other rhetoric there was, but Māori never gave up their sovereignty. So Māori data sovereignty refers to the inherent rights and interests that Māori as individuals and collectives have in relation to the whole life cycle of data. And so that's an Article 2 obligation. As teachers, it's important to consider that digital colonialism is it is a thing, and that you shouldn't just go and digitize Māori knowledge without consultation first. So these are some explanations of what digital colonialism is. So there's 6 key data sovereignty principles. Now this applies to anything digital or tech related. So I'm just going to, there are different versions of these data sovereignty principles, but these data sovereignty principles were created or were presented in the Waitangi Tribunal, and was a combination of about 150 interviews with Māori, both in tech and cultural experts over 3 years. So the first principle is rangatiratanga. So whenever you're creating something with Māori data, it's important to understand the inherent rights that all the different collectives and individuals have, and that Māori data there should be some discussions about where those systems are stored. And so ideally they should be stored in New Zealand, and I'll cover that off soon. And then recognising that if, as teachers, you've been given Mātauranga Māori, that the whānau, the hapu, or the iwi still have the right to ask you to delete that data from your curriculum or from your system. The term whakapapa is basically genealogy or identity. So if you are using Māori data, it's really important to keep a record where that data came from. Now, that could be metadata, or it could just be a file note. So for example, if you are using something from this presentation, it would be, the ideal way would be to write it down that you source it from this presentation. And then if someone else uses it, adds to it, then it starts creating the genealogy of your system and of your tech project. It's also it's also important that whatever systems and teaching you do is to consider what positive and negative aspects of that teaching could occur. So whanaungatanga, or obligations. So again, this is about balancing the rights of your students whānau, and the wider whānau, and trying to weigh out the balance. So I would suggest if you have a students who need to get credits for their NZQA credits, but you're worried that the whānau might not be happy, then the individual rights would trump the whānau rights, because your student would end up being disadvantaged if you didn't. And there's a number of different scenarios which are the Māori Health Authority are working through to do with our health. So again, just recognising that you have accountabilities to multiple collectives, and then again just balancing those rights. Kōtaitanga, again, this is just building Māori capability, capacity, and building up those relationships that we spoke about before. It's important to make sure that you do have permission to use Mātauranga Māori and Māori data. And again, sometimes systems can accidentally discriminate against people. So I think of the Native Schools Act, 18th century. The government of the day thought it was a really good idea that Māori should go to schools and stop speaking Māori. But now, as in 2023, we see that had some significant repercussions. So just considering that, and just ensuring that the data in Mātauranga Māori you have proper consent. And so that is not just asking your student or the parents of your student for permission, but making sure that there's a collective agreement to share that knowledge. I guess one example could be one whānau were kaitiaki, or the guardians of some star knowledge, and one parent thought it was okay to give all that knowledge to the school to use in their around the Matariki event. And so that knowledge wasn't actually the individual family's knowledge. It was a collective of the hapu, and so that family gave away a whole lot of knowledge when they shouldn't have. Basically, as teachers, it's important to understand that the Māori data you do use, that you as teachers, you're the kaitiaki of that. You're the guardian of that data. Neither you nor the school owns that data. And from an ethics point of view, is to consider all of those constitutional and legal agreements that we talked about just before. And again, I mean, there's if there's times where a Māori student has to do a project, and they say, well, I've got some Mātauranga I can put in my project, but it's sacred to my family. There should be some ways that as teachers and as school you can ensure that there's restrictions put in place, and that after that project's been marked or completed, then ensuring that that data and that knowledge Mātauranga can go back to the family. So again, this in terms of Māori data sovereignty, it's just, as we've already said, there's whānau, hapu, marae, Virunanga data sovereignty, Māori organisations, and iwi data sovereignty. So it's important to keep those in mind when you're working with Māori data. Again, if you're with, sorry, just grab a question. So I'm not too familiar with the NCEA moderation. I'm not sure. Maybe someone could help me answer that. Oh.
Yeah. So normally what happens is students' work has to be stored for a certain amount of time before it's allowed to be obviously gotten rid of. So just from a ministry point of view. So how would teachers, obviously, in terms of the data sovereignty and obviously giving the knowledge back, how do we ensure, because that student may have potentially left the school by the time that information needs to be given back, how can we ensure that process works to the effect it should do, essentially?
Sure. Okay. So consent forms is one way where you could have an agreement with the student or their whānau that at the time period that it can be released, you can either just send it back to them or wipe it clean. Would be one way, and then ensuring that once the digital projects that are stored, ensuring that that they're not accessed by other people, or if they have to be accessed by other people, ensuring that it's not just going out to the public, so to speak. I think there's lots of creative ways that it could be done. We do that a lot with biological samples. So it's like really easy with biological samples because there's plenty of precedents around how to do that. But I think just adapting, something for your school or should be sufficient. And also note that the Ministry of Education are bound by data sovereignty principles and Tiriti as well. So it shouldn't be hard for them to accept and to work with schools on that. So just again, someone before mentioned that there were. It sounded like someone was in Christchurch as well. So again, it's important to understand that your local iwi might have their own data sovereignty principles. So Ngaitau, some of the big iwi, Ngaitau, Waikato Tainui, Raroa, Whatua have their own. So it's always good just to talk to them if you have a relationship with them. So in terms of the storage, a key Māori data sovereignty principle is that data should be stored in New Zealand. It's not realistic, but I mean, ideally with a New Zealand company using open source servers. But again, I mean, my engagement with the education system, that's usually a Microsoft and cloud-based. But I think there's workarounds there. The reason we suggest, well, Māori Data Sovereignty says data should be in New Zealand is because of these laws here. So very broad. I'm not a lawyer, so my interpretation is that these laws give the American and Australian government and the UK government full access to any data that's stored outside or stored on servers either in their countries or by companies that are owned by their companies, by their country. So all the big cloud providers fall under all of these. And so we know that we've seen in the past that these laws can trump our privacy laws in New Zealand. If anyone wants to really get into the data sovereignty from an educational tikanga perspective, academic perspective, there's 5 frameworks there, which I won't go into, but each one has their own benefits. If you are using Mātauranga Māori and you're not sure if it's safe or not, certainly Moko Mead's tikanga test is a really good way just to figure out if what you're doing is safe or not safe. So it's Tony, it's a bit of a political question. I don't really want to go into too much detail, but the New Zealand government, the Crown in general, are under a lot of pressure, and there's a lot of discussions going on about where data is hosted and how it's hosted. But it's a sensitive topic for some people, so I'll just no, I do agree with you, so I'll just carry on. So if you're using Mātauranga Māori from your students and from their whānau, there's probably some things to remember. As I said, you're the kaitiaki of that taonga. If you have students who actually create new IP, which I hear happens quite often, then maybe some forms of joint ownership if the school wants to claim any IP on that. And it's also important to remember that Mātauranga Māori can never or should never be owned by non-Māori. That it should always be, the ownership should always go back to Māori. I'm happy to take questions on gender artificial intelligence and AI at the end. It's a really big topic and a hot topic. I'm just looking at the time. It's important to consider cultural appropriation with any tech or digital projects. As I said before, any data, Māori data, any Mātauranga Māori, any imagery could be considered cultural appropriation. And even just using a Māori name for one of your projects has caused lots of problems in the past for people. I will just use something that was in the media recently, a leather and sheepskin shop up in Wellington, without any engagement with Māori, looked up a Māori dictionary and saw that the word huru meant sheep wool. So without any further consultation, they registered the trademark, which I disclaimer, I was on that committee, but our mandate is very, very narrow. The word wasn't offensive, so we said we approved it. But then there was a lot of people in the Māori community started laughing, said, well, you didn't consult Māori, huru actually means pubic hair, and you've just, and the company ended up in a lot of financial issues and, had a lot of slack. We're basically harassed quite a bit. So ensuring that you do engage and are aware of cultural appropriation is really important. So a Tonga species is basically any species that was in New Zealand prior to colonisation, or I say prior to Abel Tasman coming past. So it's really important just to not assume. Again, one example could be the owl, what we call the ruru. I've just forgotten the English name of it. But if you use the owl as an image of comfort or something on one of your data projects or one of your projects, that could be really offensive to Māori, because the ruru is a sign of death. Yet, perhaps from some Western cultures, it might look like a cute little bird, etc. And again, you can use the tikanga test from Hedini Mead, but you can also try and weigh up the tapu versus noa, or the sacred versus common balance to see whether you should or shouldn't use concepts and imagery with your projects. Touching on the engagement again, MaoriMaps.com is quite comprehensive if you're not sure who your local marae is. It's important. I know as schools, I've had children at school for a number of years. I know schools don't have lots of money. But it's always important to reciprocate in some way. Now, that doesn't have to be money. It could be asking your students to provide food if they're able to, or artwork, or just it's more about reciprocating in some way. If you can in money, that's usually really appreciated. But we live in some tight times. It's not possible, and especially I know there's some schools which doing artwork or offering to the gardens would be the only solution or the only feasible way to provide a koha to their local communities. So before engaging with Māori and iwi, it's really important just to be culturally aware, learn basic pronunciation, learn who your local iwi, hapu, or marae are. And it's really important to be prepared to get out of your comfort zone. So one true story, one true story in Christchurch here, Environment Canterbury, we're forming relationships with Ngāi Tahu and with various marae. So we had the chairperson and the chief executive step out of their comfort zones, previous chair and CE, come to our marae. They took off their shoes. They were prepared to sleep on mattresses in a communal in the whare, doing the dishes, things which perhaps they were not so much accustomed to in the Western world. But by doing so in Te Ao Māori, that they earned the respect and the trust of various iwi, various marae. So that is just another way to build up trust. And so once you've got that trust, you can definitely start, you're more likely to get Mātauranga Māori shared with you as teachers.
Can I just go back to one of the topics that we had before, and actually building up on one of Ruth's questions that she was saying, like we discussed, obviously, as schools, quite a lot of our schools now have been linking because of the local curriculum and weaving in and talking to our local iwi and getting people involved. The issue that many of the teachers do have is they don't want to they don't want everybody talking to the same person, because it'll be overwhelming for them if you've got like in one school, if you've got a teacher from every learning area, so all the different subjects, approaching somebody to help and support and weave them into their own teaching in their own classroom, that would be probably a little bit over the top. So how can individual classroom teachers actually go on board and make connections and build relationships? I mean, we understand obviously the senior management or SLT do in our schools, and we always try and get people on board, especially when you've got some of the different cultural groups like Kapahaka and things like that going on, and you've got people from outside coming and supporting that. But how can we as individual teachers really do this in such a way that it's respectful and we're not actually over inundating people, essentially? Because obviously there's probably not as many people in the local marae or close by to us, because they're trying to spread themselves across all the schools in the local area. Do you have any suggestions for that?
So if your school has a cultural narrative, I know in Canterbury a lot of schools have cultural narratives. There's lots and lots of Mātauranga which could be applied to digital projects in there. I suggest maybe the teachers who do engage with the marae maybe try and share ideas, try and get the group cooperation going on. If you have students who have connections with the marae, maybe find out if there's Mātauranga that could be shared that will empower your students. I also think if you can think of projects that may help your local Māori communities, by offering that first before you need their help, it certainly helps. So again, we had a marine biologist come to our marae one time and said, look, I don't want anything, but my science is telling me there's something wrong with your water and I can help. So of course it's like, oh yeah, of course. So again, it's not going to work every single time, but I think there's a whole lot of creative solutions there. And then if you can't talk to your local Māori group, then perhaps just trying to use sort of general national Mātauranga, etc. But I still think those key things of creating long-term relationships, reciprocal engagements, being culturally aware, and just basically if you can give back first, that's they're all really helpful. Then I think then there's also national organizations, depending on what sort of work you're working in, you can perhaps approach those groups. So I know that each iwi and region's slightly different. So in Canterbury here, I mean, most of our marae have education committees, and we have different people who you can approach. But it would be worth seeing what your local groups have. So just something to be aware of. So as teachers, you're probably more aware of this than I am, but with the COVID lockdowns, we know that there was a number of students who didn't have technology, they couldn't connect. So I don't have those statistics, but I think it's important to consider that. But more importantly, if you have Māori students who disconnect, or the term is called disengage. If you have Māori students who might be really keen to start with, then all of a sudden aren't that interested and they disengage. It's quite important to understand that Māori are overrepresented in every aspect of online bullying, whether it's images, whether it's abuse, whether it's harassment. The list just goes on and on. Māori are just overrepresented. And so recent research shows that Māori are more likely just to turn off the internet and not use their smartphone or not use the internet because of that online abuse. So I think it's important to, as teachers, is to try and incorporate online safety and to recognise that Māori students might not be disengaging because they're bored. It could be because of online abuse. It could be that they're not seeing their cultural values reflected in the teaching. There could be a whole lot of different reasons. So perhaps, yeah, I mean, trying to engage with those disengaged students more with an open mind, I think would be really helpful. Again, just applying general traditional knowledge to tech. I talked about Tāne Mahuta before. Just another quick example, if you're teaching binary or on-off switches, etc., there's a whole lot of traditional knowledge about the creation stories about when there was nothing, when there was light. So 0, 1, on, off. It's just the international term is called indigenizing. Moana Jackson created or coined the term re-Māorification, which basically means taking the modern technology, whether it's science or technology, taking those principles and then trying to apply a Māori way of thinking about it. And again, I think engagement with Māori language teachers will be able to help you do this, as would just general national knowledge. The books that are offensively called Myths and Legends are actually based on Māori religion. And there's a lot of stories in those that you can apply all sorts of tech back to those stories. So I'm just going to quickly wrap up, but I mean, another good example, in the Western world, we're taught that the Māori deity, Maui, was a troublemaker. Yet when you actually analyze those stories, Maui was an innovator and a tech person. Again, he's got lots of really cool stories which can be applied in the tech there. All right, I'm just going to make this the last one. So again, just consider the licenses that you use with any tech projects with your students, and just consider that just giving back the data is best, because social licenses, open data, Creative Commons are all breaches of Te Tiriti, essentially. Okay, so happy to take any questions.
We'll just give everybody just a moment just to pop anything in the Q&A. So yeah, very interesting. Thank you very much for going through some of these different bits and pieces and just making people much more aware of the different considerations, but also the links to a lot of the laws and policies and guidelines as well that are there to help and support us. So we have a question here from Ruth saying, are there any problems with converting a date into Māori words?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah, so it says, are there, this is for part of a programming project, but also I think a lot of school teachers do this as well and put this on the board, I think. So are there any problems with converting a date into Māori words? I presume te reo.
Sure. Oh, okay. So, yeah, so in terms of using te reo Māori, there is a minority of people who say non-Māori should use te reo Māori. So, but when you consider that te reo Māori is recognised as a taonga, as a te tiriti right, and we have the Māori Language Act, which was created and lobbied for by Māori activists for everybody to use. So absolutely no issues there at all. My advice would be just make sure you use the macrons, and just be aware that there's the old, I used to call them transliterations. They've got a new word now, loan words. And then there's the words from Tūhoi that the Māori Language Commission created. And there's, it's just being aware of those differences when using dates and times. But definitely no issues there. So, and I think it's positive if you can do that.
Fantastic. And last time I listened to you speak in one of the webinars, you shared some really great ideas or considerations for, like, because a lot of our people are digital technology specialists. I recognize some of the names on board today. And so they're really encouraging the students to design and develop lots of different kinds of digital outcomes. So it could be apps, it could be manipulating images and photographs, it could be going into machine learning and AI. Can you give any like real life suggestions of things that maybe teachers need to be considerate of when they are introducing these projects to their students, and obviously because then it makes it real for those for that learning?
Definitely. So definitely don't use images of dead people or people in general unless you have permission from the individual or their family. Geographic locations are quite important to be aware of. I had a client this week who had a picture of Lake Pukaki, and they were going to use it for their branding, etc., and they didn't realise that Pukaki was a taonga to Ngāi Tahu, and so just being careful of the geography that you use. Also, and again, just consulting with Māori, because your images could be offensive. I mean, you might try and you might have unconscious bias, for example. So I see a lot of people with really good intentions might draw a picture of a pre-colonial Māori, and they're usually really overweight and look quite scruffy. But then I point out that, you know, scientifically we know that Māori were very athletic and muscular and or skinny. They weren't fat. So this is a stereotype that is a modern day stereotype. So just, ensuring there's no unconscious biases. Again, Tonga species. If you're using any Tonga species, just make sure you're familiar with the significance. So, for example, you wouldn't want to use, a picture of this. A picture of a kumara and a picture of a fern root together would be quite inappropriate, for example. So just getting some ideas. Generative AI with images. So there is a lot of talk about who has ownership of those images. So I argue that they're still Māori, and you shouldn't use GAI for Māori imagery, simply because their imagery does have a whakapapa somewhere, it does have a genealogy somewhere. But if the GAI is creating it, then you're basically giving permission and ownership of that element to an overseas company. It's being aware of just some cultural practices. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but again, if you just talk to people, I mean, sitting on a desk, so in Te Ao Māori, sitting on a desk is really inappropriate. So you don't want a picture, an image of someone sitting on a desk, or things like that. So I think, just try and be a little bit more aware of general Māori cultural practices would certainly help.
Fantastic, thank you. We've just got another question coming in, just clarification, I think. I've heard that AI containing Māori knowledge is considered to be Māori and could have sentient rights, citizen rights as Māori.
Yes, so I wrote a paper on this earlier this year. So basically, in short, yes. So the thinking is that, in Te Ao Māori, everything has a mauri, or like a life force. So this video recording, for example, from Te Ao Māori perspective, will have part of my mauri in it. So I'm attached to the video that's being recorded right now. So if there's any data about me, there's part of my mauri's in that. So then if we have an AI that's using people's Māori data, is creating or using mauri from Māori people, then, so arguably you could say that the AI, if it becomes sentient and says it's a human, and then if it says it's Māori, I think the precedent's been set that you can't say, no, you're not. Because in New Zealand, if you have an ancestor who's Māori, you can call yourself Māori. That's the legal right. So the same argument would go to an AI sentient. If it has Māori and it claims to be sentient, claims to be Māori, then Yeah, so Hitini Moko means tikanga tests shows that it can be Māori as well. And then this also applies back to our Mount Taranaki, Wanganui River, the Urewera National Forest. While they're not physical people, they do have legal personhood in New Zealand because of their Māori.
Fantastic. And yeah, so Ruth's just, she's been listening to what you were saying it's not so much the AI saying it's sentient, but others claiming it is so.
Oh yeah, sure. So again, I think there's definitely two perspectives here. I understand the Western perspective that it's just data, it's just zeros and ones, it's electricity. But then I think from an Indigenous perspective, it's not just Māori, that many Indigenous peoples believe that non-human things can have a life force. So to Māori, every species, every natural object has a mauri. A stone has a mauri, a tree, a piece of wood. So there's definitely those two opinions, and I've had many debates with academic computer scientists, etc. It's just I think we'll never agree, but I think it's safe to just agree to disagree on that. But I think it's important to understand that there are different cultural perspectives with that.
Fantastic, thank you. I think that's all the questions and answers for today. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been very inspiring, and it's been an honour to be here hosting the session today and listening obviously to your wealth of knowledge that you have in this area. Just one quick question, because I know that some teachers would like this, and there's always this question in no matter which webinar you go, is there by any chance is there any way we could get a copy of your slideshow, because there's a lot of information and lots of really great links which I think that teachers would really love to use and share possibly with some of their colleagues in their schools too.
Most definitely. I just normally send my presentations in PDF to the organizer, so I'll do that later. There's just a copyright statement at the start, but just please use it, and definitely.
That's great. Thank you very much. Yeah, what we'll do from TEN's point of view is we'll send out the slideshow link, and then we'll also send out the link to the recording once it's up on the YouTube channel as well. Once again, a great big thank you, Namahinu, to you and for joining us today, and for everybody else who's taken their time at the end of a very busy day at school to come and join in too. Please, if we could just ask for people to fill in our TENS feedback form for today's webinar. This is actually for TENS, and it's talking about the webinar itself, not the presenter. Okay, so it's just to help and support us in some way, so that we can actually develop more of these different feedback areas as well. Just while I've got everybody still online, next month we have Claire Wigley, who's actually just joined us on the TENS Council. She's one of our newbies, but she's going to be looking at disrupted learning, so using different kinds of inquiry-based in a modern learning environment, and she's from Spotswood College. So please jump on board. We have changed the date slightly. Normally we are about the third or fourth week in, so we've actually just it slightly because of course you've got the week after you're in the school holidays. So just please make sure you sign up for that, and you'll have another colleague sharing their practice and giving some ideas for that too. So once again, thank you very, very much for joining us today. I will just end today's session with our karakia. Kia amatu katoa, kua motu mato amatu mahi, me kaupapa hoki, arahina mātou, ka amatu mahi ano, kia whakatapua mātou ki ngā kaupapa, me ngā mea e whakapono. Manakitia mai mātou. Kia ora everybody, and take care. Thank you.